Okay, you all good? Let's do it. Hello and welcome to the B2C Lead Generation Podcast.
Welcome back to the B2C Lead Gen Podcast. My name is Daniel Hopewell here with Simon Delaney, and this is episode 75, Deduplication. It is what it is, except when it isn't. And as you may expect from that title, we're going to be deep diving into deduplication today, covering the basics, but also the nuances and subtleties you may need to consider. Simon, let's start off with an overview of deduplication. Let's keep this quick, but just what is it? When do you need it? How does it work?
So deduplication is typically where you've had a prospect come in as a lead, bit of data, and that person comes in again, and they call that a dedupe. The difference with it being a customer is a customer would normally be a suppression rather than a dedupe. A dedupe is specific to other prospects.
So basically, you're stopping people paying twice for a lead they already have, in theory. Sounds great, sounds pretty simple, but as the title suggested, obviously it's not as black and white as deduping people and leaving it running. There are exceptions to the rule. There are things where you have to consider nuances such as this. So let's talk through the extra things people need to consider, which maybe they're not.
So I think there was one thing that you just mentioned, which is imagine that if you're buying leads, it's quite easy, right? Because if you just had a lead come in an hour ago and the same lead came in again from either the same supplier or someone else and all the same details and everything, it'd be quite a simple choice to make to dedupe them. What if it was your own landing page and the lead came in again? Can happen, right? Like what do you do in that scenario? Strange scenario of this person's just come in on the landing page for Vodafone, and an hour later this person's just come in again on the landing page for Vodafone. Now that you would normally apply dedupe, right? Because you go, this is an hour ago. But what if it's fallen through the cracks, or it's gone to the sales team and they haven't been able to get hold of them, and so they've got them on a dialing cycle. Let's imagine it's a telephone lead, and they're going to be calling them again in 5 hours. But this person's just submitted the form again because they want to call at that moment. What are you going to do? It's rhetorical. I'm asking.
I don't the silence. If I'm comfortable with the silence.
No, but these are the sort of things you have to decide with dedupe. So this is the beginning of what I'm talking about, that once you delve beneath the surface, it's never as simple as you'd possibly imagine. So in that scenario, if you are the brand generating the lead and you're going to be calling it, I mean, you're typically buying this data at the coalface on the CPC anyway. So all the costs have been incurred. You're going to just drive that lead back into the sales process and start it off again. Or, I mean, if you can do an update back to the original lead, but I mean, it's as easy just to drive it in. So that's number one scenario. So if you are buying the data or the lead yourself on a CPC at the front end and a lead comes in again, I'd suggest you don't even have dedupe applied. It's just be pointless. Just let it come straight in. Now, this changes if you are buying leads from third parties. Now, you could have that same scenario, right? So someone's just submitted a form and it's come in. But imagine now another supplier. So you've got two suppliers. One submitted it. An hour later, it comes in from someone else. And that's two different lead generation landing pages. Now, there's two scenarios that have happened here. One is they're just wanting a quote from something else and they don't recognize it's going to the same end buyer. And why would they if it's two different lead generation brands? Or the other is the same thing has happened. It's, has it fallen through the cracks? Have the salespeople not been able to get a hold of it? Are they submitting another quote because they didn't hear from the first company? And in that scenario, this is why feedback loops are important. Back to the position of where the dedupe happens. So let's say it's in, I'm not trying to sell data ball here, wink, wink. But if one of our clients was in that scenario, I would say you've got to feed back the outcome to the entity that's doing the dedupe. Because if you don't, effectively you're just gonna have to let the lead back in again. But if you know that spoken to or asked me to call back or something else, you know that you could potentially dedupe it. So in that scenario, you could apply dedupe, but it has a caveat of feeding back what happened to that data once it went into a sales process. There's another thing within this, which is the level of intent that a lead has. So if it's low intent data, so let's say, I don't know, it's a call center buying co-sponsor leads or co-reg leads, and they get the same lead an hour later, but their conversion rates of this data are like, 2%, and their connection rate on the first dial is like, I don't know, 20%. You may as well dedupe it. I mean, they're just going to cycle through that data anyway. And because there's less intent, there's less like this immediate thing of contacting this person again. It's just a lead that, happens to come in. Probably it'd be like calling the phone book anyway. So the reality is you may as well just have dedupe on. And what you're really then deciding is how long do we leave dedupe on? And this comes back to the sales cycle that data goes through. So if it's going into a call center and that call center has a month-long sales cycle of data, so it's trying to contact data for a month or whatever the period is, that's typically how long the dedupe would last for. Because once it's ended, come out of that sales cycle, you may as well accept the lead again, unless again there's a feedback loop where this person says don't ever contact me again, or you do actually sell to them, so they become a customer and potentially a suppression, or something else happens whereby you don't want to potentially contact that person again. There's a callback for after the time period that the sales cycle has lasted for. But what happens if you have a low intent lead, a co-reg lead or co-sponsor or something, come in, and then an hour later you have the same lead come in from a high intent source, a lead generation page from a PPC keyword?
That's what you're saying.
What do you do?
Well,
So
in that scenario, though, I mean, you would assume that that person has increased their intent for whatever they've been looking at for the last hour or so, and are a point that you don't want to be losing that.
Yeah, but imagine there was no intent on the first submission, or it's barely negligible. And on the high intent submission is 100%. But your dedupe rules are set up to just reject leads that contain the same information. So even if you had like telephone number and email address or postcode and first name, whatever it is, what you're going to do? Because you might then be in a sales cycle with that first lead where you're not going to be calling them for another 6 hours. So this like extremely warm prospect that's come in from a high intent source, and you've got all these dedupe rules set up against them, what you're going to do? So when you look at it that way, you think, well, we need to bypass the rules from high intent sources. Unless we've spoken to that individual. Because if you've already spoken to them, right? So imagine they've already spoken to the low intent one. Again, this comes back to the feedback loop of what's happened with the outcome of this individual. So you had a low intent lead come in, you've spoken to them, some outcome has happened, and then an hour later they come in again from a high intent source. It's a difficult one, right? These are the sort of things, this is why deduplication is just not as simple as it possibly seems.
As you're talking, I feel like it's as much about knowing when not to use it, it is about knowing when to use it. Like these weird exceptions to it. It's strange.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, knowing when to turn it off, but there's always rules around it of what's been the outcome with the person's data, because that's really what you need to base it on. It needs to be like extremely outcome based. And what happens if you've got the email address for someone, but not the telephone number, but you've got dedupe on email and they submit the telephone number, or vice versa? You've got dedupe on telephone number and it comes in again, but with an email address. What are you going to do? Because normally you just dedupe it, right? You're deduping it on a single field. But now you're in a scenario where, well, we've got some other contact method here. So we need to be able to update the original lead, or have this as the new lead that we use as the contact method. And it's the same. I mean, it sort of comes back to the idea of like intent of, what if it's like a marketing qualified lead and it then comes in as a sales qualified lead? But people don't ever set up dedupe to handle these sort of scenarios. What they tend to do is have it quite binary. So it's just like dedupe on for all time, or they'll do it to like a time limit, like their sales cycle. But once you start digging into the intent of the lead and the source it came from, and then matching the outcomes back against the people that you've spoken to, that's actually where dedupe needs to come in. For low intent leads where there's like, very little, like, they probably don't even know you're going to be contacting them. I just keep it on all, like, constantly within sales cycles if you are going to get that sort of data. Where there's high intent, you have to be a lot more strategic and sort of tactical about it all.
So it's almost like you need to work out the best practices for each scenario and kind of set up the rules based on the best possible chance of not making mistakes, or avoiding making mistakes with this.
I think you base it on three things, which is the level of intent that the lead potentially has, the sales cycle that the lead is going through, and then the outcome of any conversations or communication with that lead. You combine those three things to decide the dedupe that's actually going to be running. So for example, you might have one campaign that all the leads are coming into, but two suppliers are much higher quality. So you might turn dedupe off on them if they submit the lead, providing that you've not had an outcome that says not to from a low intent lead.
And just to explain how these kind of things work, because the way maybe people who are not familiar with using it, or maybe only use it in a very superficial on-off sense, how would you put those elements in? So it's not just a case of simply putting, dedupes on, but almost it's like a footnote. However, if this happens and this happens, how would you write that in, or how would you practically apply that? Using one of the examples we said, if the lead's already there, but it's a better channel or something like that, how would you actually apply that rule?
So I'm just thinking of how I like to apply it in Databall. So what you'd do is you'd apply a dedupe for the sales cycle period and have that against the low intent leads, and you'd apply it against whatever fields you wanted. So let's say telephone. And then what you'd do is have the lead sources with a higher intent with dedupe on those fields, but also dedupe on the outcome. So effectively you'd have that as all fields, whereas the low intent suppliers would just be telephone. So what it'd mean is that the dedupe from the high intent suppliers would only be applied if there was an outcome in a set period of time from a low intent supplier. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'm just thinking logically how I'd apply it.
It's hard to, I'm quite a visual person, as you're talking to me, I'd have to sort of see things in front of me to sort of, put this and this is like a roadmap. But I'm sure some people will be like, yeah, that makes complete sense even in an audio learning perspective. But it makes sense, yeah, but I think it highlights the fact that it's pretty complicated, or not complicated, but there's a whole spectrum of this, which people need to consider. It's not just on and off dedupes. I've got new in it. It's
exactly. It's a bit like the podcast we did the other week about verification. It's not binary. You can't just turn it on and off. There's a load of nuances within deduplication that once you start digging into it, you start realizing, it's just not that simple.
This is where, like I say, this is where the best practices come in. Like you highlighted a few there. In this particular scenario, do we want this to go through or not? But you base that on having done it for so long, like you understand, okay, this one probably is worth passing through. This one actually is very unlikely to convert, so we will dedupe it. It's almost like you need experience and you need to speak to people who have done this for quite a while to go and work out what those best practices are.
Yeah, it's. I think the moment you get into sort of lead buying at different levels of intent of leads, and start scaling up volume, where dedupes start becoming like an issue, that's when you really start digging into it and thinking out these funnels of like how it can't be that simple, but at the same time you're trying to keep it as simple as possible as well.
Yeah, if you do it on an individual lead basis, you can be picky about this. If you're doing millions of leads, then you need to work out the outcome and the set of rules that is the best for the majority, because it's just you're not going to be able to scale that kind of level. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I think deduplication, it is what it is, except when it isn't. I don't know whether it was either of those things, whether that worked, but I think we covered a few things, and yeah, a good deep dive into deduplication. That was episode 75.
Thanks for listening to the B2C Lead Generation Podcast. Be sure to hit subscribe to hear more from those at the very cutting edge of the lead gen world.